a message from a woman I had never met appeared on my phone. It read, "Your husband and I have been together for 4 years. I'm carrying his baby." At that moment, my husband was sleeping peacefully right beside me. I didn't cry, scream, or wake him up. Instead, I quietly picked up my phone and made a single call. Later, when that woman opened her front door and saw who was standing there, the color instantly drained from her face. Hello, everyone. This is Diana once again. Thank you for joining me today. If you enjoy these stories, please subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and tell me in the comments which city you're listening from. I love seeing how far these stories reach. People often say they would immediately know if their spouse was being unfaithful. They say it with certainty. I'd feel it. I'd notice the signs. I used to think the same way. I truly believed I would never be blindsided. That belief disappeared the night I was lying beside my husband of 11 years and received a message from a stranger claiming she was pregnant with his child. But before I tell you about that night, let me go back to a time when my life still felt normal. My name is Claire Whitfield. I'm 41 years old and lived in a quiet neighborhood outside Charlotte, North Carolina. I taught English at a local high school. My evenings were spent grading essays at the kitchen table, and every Sunday I made the same family dinner. I knew my neighbors, paid my bills, and lived a simple, predictable life. It wasn't exciting, but it was stable. My husband, Daniel, worked as a civil engineer for a reputable company downtown. Together we had 2 children, Lily, who was 14, and Mason, who was 11, as well as a golden retriever named Biscuit, who slept at the end of our bed. Like many married couples, we shared a mortgage, family routines, and regular date nights. Whenever people asked how our marriage was going, I always answered with the same word: we're fine. Now I realize that fine can sometimes be the most dangerous word in a relationship. It often means people have stopped paying attention. The first changes appeared during the spring of the previous year. Daniel began staying at work later than usual. Not late enough to raise immediate suspicion. Just an extra hour or 2. There was always a reasonable explanation. Project deadlines, client meetings, site inspections. I accepted every explanation without question. Then his attitude toward his phone changed. For years we had known each other's passcodes simply because there was never any need for secrecy. One evening, while washing dishes, I picked up his phone to check the time. Before I could look at it, Daniel crossed the kitchen and gently took it from my hand with a smile. "I've got it," he said. I convinced myself it meant nothing. A few months later, while doing laundry, I found a receipt in his jacket pocket. It was for dinner for 2 at a restaurant 47 miles away, one I had never heard of. When I asked about it, he claimed it was a business lunch. I pointed out that the receipt was dated Saturday. Without hesitation, he explained that the client had only been available over the weekend. Again, I chose to believe him. Then came the gym membership. Daniel hadn't willingly stepped into a gym in years, yet suddenly he was working out, buying better-fitting clothes, and wearing cologne during the week. Still, I ignored the warning signs. That's what happens when you've loved someone for more than a decade. You become skilled at explaining away things you don't want to face. Everything changed on a Thursday night in November. Daniel had gone to sleep unusually early. I sat in bed scrolling through my phone while he slept peacefully beside me. Then an Instagram notification appeared. It was a direct message from a woman named Renata Voss. Her profile picture showed a smiling brunette standing in what looked like a kitchen. The message was short. "We've been together for 4 years. I'm pregnant with his child. I thought you deserved to know." I read those words over and over. Daniel was only a few feet away from me. I could hear him breathing. Oddly enough, I wasn't shaking. I didn't fall apart. Instead, a cold stillness settled inside me. I placed my phone on the nightstand and stared at the ceiling for a long time. Then I quietly called my sister, Angela. She answered almost immediately. The moment she heard my voice, she knew something was wrong. I read the message to her word for word. After several seconds of silence, she said, "Don't wake him up. Don't confront him tonight. Say absolutely nothing." I agreed. She told me to come to her apartment the next morning and bring my laptop. That night, while lying beside the man I had built my life with, I mentally listed everything I might lose: my marriage, my home, my future, and the image of my family I had spent years protecting. I never slept. By sunrise, one thought kept repeating in my mind. 4 years? If the message was true, the affair had begun during the 7th year of our marriage. While we celebrated birthdays, attended school events, and lived our ordinary family life, another relationship had been unfolding in secret. The next morning, fear replaced shock. Not emotional fear, but practical fear. What should I do next? And how could I avoid making a mistake? I knew that confronting Daniel without evidence would accomplish nothing. A man capable of hiding a 4-year affair would almost certainly deny everything. So instead of acting emotionally, I decided to act strategically. That day, Angela and I began investigating. We found Renata's social media profile. She was 32 years old, worked as a graphic designer, and lived in Asheville. The distance from Asheville to our house, 47 miles. Exactly the same distance listed on the restaurant receipt. As we dug deeper into our finances, the situation became even worse. Small withdrawals, unfamiliar transfers, and a credit card I never knew existed revealed that Daniel had been financing an entirely separate life. My attorney later advised me to gather evidence, protect financial records, and remain silent until everything was properly documented. So that's exactly what I did. I smiled at dinner. I made conversation. I acted as though nothing had changed. Meanwhile, I quietly collected every piece of information I could find. 11 days after receiving the message, I finally spoke directly with Renata. She confirmed everything. Not only had the affair been ongoing for years, but Daniel had promised her he was leaving me. She sent me text messages, photographs, hotel reservations, and proof of their relationship stretching back more than 3 years. One photo was taken inside my own kitchen. That was the moment any remaining doubt disappeared. My attorney filed for divorce. Daniel was served at work. When he walked through our front door that evening, he looked completely stunned. "You filed for divorce?" he asked. "Yes," I replied. For the first time in years, he realized he no longer controlled the situation. He attempted excuses, denial, and eventually apologies. But by then, I had already seen the truth. The affair was real, the pregnancy was real, and the marriage I thought I had was already gone. What happened next surprised me even more. Because once Daniel's secret became public, it stopped being my problem alone. 2 days after the divorce papers were delivered, Renata contacted him directly. Whatever was said during that conversation was serious enough that Daniel immediately called his mother. The following Saturday morning, my mother-in-law, Lorraine Whitfield, arrived at my front door carrying a pie and wearing the same expression she had worn for decades, an expression that always suggested her son could do no wrong. Lorraine was 68 years old, deeply involved in her church, and had always seemed bothered by the fact that I was capable and independent. "Claire," she said, standing at my doorstep as if I were the one who owed explanations. I opened the door but made no effort to welcome her inside. She immediately began explaining why I was making a terrible mistake. According to her, every marriage faces challenges. Daniel was a good man who had simply made a poor decision. The children needed their father. Renata, she claimed, was manipulative and emotionally unstable. Daniel had supposedly tried to end the relationship long ago, but she refused to accept it. Then she warned me that if I continued with the divorce, I would regret it. I listened patiently. When she finally finished, I looked at her and said, "Lorraine, I'm going to ask you to leave. Any further communication should go through my attorney." Something changed in her expression. Not disappointment, not shock, something colder. "You'll regret this," she replied. It wasn't reassurance. It was a threat. 3 days later, I received an email from an attorney I had never heard of, now representing Daniel. The message was written in polished legal language, but the intention was obvious. It hinted that moving forward with the divorce could raise concerns regarding my suitability as the children's primary residential parent. It referenced vague allegations of emotional instability. No evidence was included because none existed. The entire purpose was intimidation. I immediately forwarded the email to Susan. "They're nervous," she told me. "This is what nervous looks like." That weekend, I took Lily and Mason away for a short trip to the mountains. Nothing extravagant, just a small cabin with a fireplace, surrounded by trees and disconnected from phone service. For 48 hours, there were no lawyers, no court documents, and no decisions to make. Lily spent most of her time reading. Mason explored every hiking trail he could find. In the evenings, I sat on the porch watching the trees sway in the cold air. I wasn't healed, I wasn't okay, but I was beginning to think clearly. And clarity, I discovered, can be a form of strength. When we returned home, I found a handwritten letter waiting on the kitchen counter. Daniel still had a key. That issue was corrected the following morning. By 9 o'clock, the locks had been changed, and only Angela and I had copies of the new keys. Then I read the letter. 3 pages. Written in Daniel's familiar handwriting. He filled it with memories from our life together. The birth of Mason, family vacations, moments from our early years. He wrote about feeling lost. He wrote about loving me. He wrote that he wanted to come home. And near the end, he asked me to think carefully about everything we would lose if I continued with the divorce. The letter was beautifully written. But when I examined it honestly, I realized it was not an apology. It was a strategy. Every memory he chose highlighted moments when I had been happy. Every argument focused on what I stood to lose by leaving. The children, the house, the life we had built. What he never mentioned was what I had already lost. He never wrote about years of deception. He never wrote about the affair. He never wrote about the child on the way. He never acknowledged the damage he had caused. After reading it twice, I set it aside and made myself a cup of coffee. A few minutes later, my phone rang. The caller ID was unfamiliar. It was Renata. Somehow she had learned about the letter. Whether Daniel had shown it to her or she had discovered it herself, I never learned. What mattered was what she told me next. "He's trying to come back to you," she said. "He thinks you'll drop the divorce." "I won't," I answered. There was silence. Then her voice softened. "I need to know what's going to happen to my baby." For the first time, she sounded frightened. Daniel had stopped taking her calls. He had instructed her to speak only through his lawyer. At that moment, I realized something uncomfortable. She had been deceived too. Whatever responsibility she bore for the affair, she'd also been promised a future that Daniel never intended to give her. He had manipulated both of us. "I can't give legal advice," I told her carefully. "But if I were you, I'd hire an attorney whose only job is protecting your interests." "Why are you helping me?" she asked. "Because your child deserves someone looking out for them," I said. "And right now, that person isn't their father." After the call ended, I sat quietly for a long time. Support arrived from places I never expected. One source was Patricia, a fellow teacher at school who had gone through a divorce years earlier. When I finally told her what was happening, she never treated me like a tragedy. Instead, she brought lunch to my classroom several times each week and talked about ordinary things: history lessons, students, weekend plans, normal life. That normality was exactly what I needed. Angela also found a support group for women navigating divorce and co-parenting. I attended a few meetings and quickly realized how valuable they were. The women there were practical, resilient, and honest. Being around them reminded me that rebuilding a life after betrayal was not unusual. Many had done it before. I could too. Then there was Lily. Long before we officially told the children that Daniel would be living elsewhere, she sensed something had changed. When we finally sat them down and explained the situation, she remained calm. She listened carefully and asked a few thoughtful questions. Later that evening, she came into my room. "Mom," she asked quietly, "you're going to be okay, right?" "Yes," I told her. And for the first time, I genuinely believed it. 4 weeks into the divorce proceedings, something unexpected happened. One Sunday morning, Daniel and Lorraine arrived together. I watched them walk toward the house from the kitchen window. Daniel carried a paper bag from our favorite bakery. The message was obvious: comfort, familiarity, a reminder of happier times. Lorraine was dressed carefully despite the cold weather, clearly expecting to be invited inside. When I opened the door, Daniel asked if we could talk. He said it was about the children, about avoiding unnecessary destruction. I allowed them inside, not because I was persuaded, because I wasn't afraid. We sat at the kitchen table. Daniel spoke first. To his credit, he had prepared. He admitted what he had done was wrong. He discussed the children's stability, the financial cost of a prolonged legal battle, the importance of preserving as much normalcy as possible. Then Lorraine took over. At first, she sounded sympathetic, but gradually her real objective emerged. She argued that involving lawyers and courts was turning a private matter into a public spectacle. She mentioned dignity. She mentioned gossip. Then she brought up my career. "You're a teacher, Claire," she said. "People talk. Keeping this quiet would protect you." There it was. Not concern, pressure. A warning disguised as advice. "Are you suggesting I abandon the divorce to protect my reputation?" I asked. "I'm suggesting there are more discreet ways to handle this," she replied. Daniel watched silently, waiting, testing, trying to determine which version of me was sitting across the table. The woman who smoothed everything over, or the woman who had changed the locks. "I'd like both of you to leave," I said. Daniel's expression shifted. "Claire, if there's anything else to discuss," I interrupted, "Susan Hale can be contacted directly." Lorraine rose slowly from her chair. "You're making a mistake you can't undo." I met her gaze. "I spent 11 years making those," I said. "I'm finished now." They left. Afterward, I sat alone at the kitchen table. My hands were trembling slightly, not because they had changed my mind, but because fear still lingered. What if this became uglier? What if they found some way to hurt me? What if I wasn't prepared? Instead of pushing those fears away, I acknowledged them. Then I called Susan and repeated every detail of the visit. "Good," she said. "Write everything down while it's fresh." So I did. 4 full pages. And by the time I finished, the fear had become something manageable, a reminder rather than a threat. Their visit had never been about reconciliation. It had been about shrinking me, making me doubt myself. And I was done shrinking. The deposition took place in early March. By then, Susan and I had spent months building an overwhelming record of evidence: financial statements, hidden transfers, credit card records, text messages, hotel reservations, and one major discovery: a secret savings account Daniel had opened 4 years earlier. The balance exceeded $41,000, an exit fund. He had been preparing for a future without me while pretending nothing was wrong. Throughout this process, I never revealed what we knew. I allowed him to continue believing he was managing the situation. The deposition lasted 4 hours. At first, everything seemed controlled. Daniel answered carefully. His attorney had clearly prepared him. Then Susan began asking about the hidden account. The pauses started. The contradictions followed. When she introduced the text messages and supporting documentation, I saw something change in Daniel's face. For the first time, he realized there was no version of this story he could successfully rewrite. The evidence was simply too strong. Question after question exposed inconsistencies: the account, the affair, the plans he had made, the promises he had given. By the end of the day, his credibility had collapsed. When Susan presented the photograph taken inside my kitchen, Daniel stopped speaking entirely. His attorney requested a break. Neither of them returned. Walking out of the deposition, I expected to feel victorious. Instead, I felt calm. The kind of calm that comes after carrying something heavy for a very long time and finally setting it down. The next day, settlement negotiations began. Over several weeks, the attorneys exchanged proposals. The first offer favored Daniel too heavily. The second was better. The third came close. The final agreement, signed in late April, gave me full ownership of the house, with Daniel required to cooperate in removing his name from the mortgage. I was awarded primary residential custody of Lily and Mason, along with a carefully structured visitation arrangement designed to protect the children's stability and well-being. The settlement gave me a fair division of our assets, including a significant portion of the $41,000 savings account that had drawn considerable attention during the proceedings. It also required Daniel to maintain health insurance for both children until they turned 26 and to contribute to their college funds according to a strict, clearly defined schedule, one written so precisely that any deviation would legally qualify as contempt of court. In addition, he was required to formally acknowledge, as part of the agreement, that his financial behavior during the marriage had been deceptive. That clause had not been easy to secure. Daniel's attorney had resisted it heavily. Susan had refused to back down. I hadn't needed it for public record purposes. It wouldn't be public anyway. I needed it for myself. After 11 years of convincing myself everything was fine, I needed something in writing that confirmed it had not been. Lorraine was not included in the settlement because legally she had no standing to be. Her appearance at my home that Sunday had been documented carefully and included in the case file, but it ultimately did nothing to support her position. It helped mine. Renata reached a separate agreement with Daniel's attorney about 2 weeks later. I was not part of those discussions and was never informed of the details. All I was told, briefly and professionally, was that provisions had been made for the child. Whether Daniel felt anything about becoming a father under those circumstances, I could not say. By then, I had stopped trying to interpret the inner world of a man who had successfully kept an entire hidden life running for 4 years. What I hadn't expected was how quiet the moment of signing the final settlement would feel. I had imagined something dramatic. Relief, closure, maybe even emotion. Instead, it was a Thursday afternoon in a neutral conference room that smelled faintly of printer ink and stale coffee. Susan slid the papers across the table. I signed my name 4 times. I initialed several pages. And just like that, it was over. 11 years of marriage, 4 years of deception, months of evidence gathering, planning, and emotional restraint. All concluded in 12 minutes with a pen in my hand while someone typed in the next room. On the drive home, something inside me shifted. The late afternoon light over the highway in Charlotte had that soft golden tone that makes even ordinary roads feel meaningful. I turned the radio up. I didn't cry. I sang along instead. Badly, without caring. When everything was finalized, I picked up Lily from school and Mason from soccer practice. We stopped for milkshakes on the way home. Mason passionately defended chocolate peanut butter as the only acceptable flavor. Lily argued for strawberry with the seriousness of someone building a philosophy. We drove with the windows down despite the chill. Biscuit stuck his head out the back window, ears flapping in the wind, while Mason laughed so hard he almost dropped his drink. When we pulled into the driveway, I stayed in the car for a moment after they got out. Doors slammed. The dog ran ahead. Their voices filled the evening air in that ordinary, chaotic way that suddenly felt like something precious. And I realized I hadn't collapsed. I hadn't broken. I hadn't become someone else just to survive what someone else had done. I got out of the car and went inside to cook dinner. A year later, life looked different in ways I never could have predicted. I was still teaching. In fact, I had been promoted to department head that spring after 3 days of hesitation and a very direct conversation with Patricia, who told me plainly that I was the obvious choice and needed to stop overthinking it. My classroom had changed too. New bookshelves, finally installed, and a repainted window frame I had been asking permission to fix for 6 years. At home, things were not quieter exactly. Teenagers don't allow for that. But they were lighter. Saturday mornings were no longer rigid. Dinners turned into conversations. Evenings often ended with Lily reading on the couch, Mason doing homework on the floor, and Biscuit stretched across his legs. The absence of tension became something I could actually feel. I started running again. Not for fitness goals, not for discipline, just for the experience of moving through the neighborhood before sunrise when everything was still and my thoughts finally slowed down. I also joined a ceramics class on Tuesday nights at the community center. I was not good at it. My first bowls leaned and collapsed in ways that made Mason laugh endlessly. But that was part of the point. There was something deeply freeing about working on something that didn't carry consequences. No stakes, no performance, no need to hold everything perfectly together. By spring, I made a bowl that could actually hold water without leaking, and I placed it on the kitchen windowsill where the morning light hit it just right. I found myself genuinely proud of it, in a way that didn't depend on anyone else's opinion. That feeling was new and important. The Thursday support group slowly became something I looked forward to rather than something I endured. The women there were not broken. They were practical, honest, and often unexpectedly funny. We met outside the group too. We had dinners, shared stories about our children, and talked about everyday life like people rebuilding something real. One woman named Diane, who had gone through a far more complicated divorce than mine, started a small business and asked me to edit her website. I did. She sent me a plant in return. It was still alive on my desk months later, which I considered a small miracle. Angela visited for dinner twice a month, always bringing wine and sharp humor. She started seeing someone, a history professor she described as aggressively adequate, which I understood to be high praise coming from her. I wasn't looking for anything, not at all. But I did have coffee one Saturday with a man named James, a university professor who ran the same trail I did in the mornings. It was just coffee, just conversation. And yet, when I drove home afterward, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not hope exactly, just openness. The door wasn't closed anymore. As for Daniel, he lived in a small apartment in Asheville. I knew this only because of custody arrangements that required occasional coordination. He had taken a job at a smaller firm, less prestigious, closer to where Renata lived. Mason once described the apartment simply as pretty small, without judgment, and I didn't add any of my own. Renata had given birth in February, a girl. I only learned the child's name indirectly through Mason, who mentioned it casually, as children do. Daniel and Renata, from what little I could gather, were not thriving. A relationship built on distance and secrecy had collided with the reality of sleepless nights, limited space, and truth that could no longer be avoided. She had apparently discovered inconsistencies in his behavior, his calendar, his routines. I heard this later through quiet channels, the kind of updates people share without realizing they are sharing them. It seemed he had not changed, only his audience had. There were also hints that Renata had consulted her own attorney. Not for child support, that part was already settled, but for other concerns. I didn't follow the details. It was no longer mine to manage. Lorraine, meanwhile, was no longer speaking to me. That arrangement suited both of us. She had shifted her attention toward the children, but Susan had already accounted for that in the custody terms, which limited its impact. Lily, now 15 and fully capable of drawing her own boundaries, eventually told her grandmother calmly that she was willing to talk about anything except divorce things. The response, according to Lily, was surprise, followed by silence. How did she take it? I asked later. She looked shocked, Lily said. Then she changed the subject. She continued eating. So, I think it worked. I looked at her then, steady, thoughtful, kind in a way that requires real strength, and felt something quiet settle in me. Pride. Not the loud kind, the grounded kind. I hadn't just survived what happened, I had shown my children, without planning to, what it looks like to stay intact when life stops making sense. And that mattered more than anything else. The truth doesn't wait for permission. It simply exists. What you control is when you face it, and what you decide to do once you do. I chose to face it. I chose strategy over panic, clarity over chaos. Not because I was exceptional, but because I knew I couldn't afford to fall apart. And in the end, that choice changed everything.